The sun was a brutal, unrelenting hammer pounding down on the arid, windswept landscape of eastern Ukraine. For the men of the 128th Brigade's 231st Battalion, the desolate terrain around Zaporizhzhia had become a bitter home. It was a world of shattered farmhouses, trench lines carved into the black earth, and the ever-present, gnawing tension of a front line that could erupt into violence at any moment. Among these men, moving with a quiet purpose, was Svitlana. To them, she was simply Doc, a lifeline in the chaos. Before the full-scale invasion upended her world, she had been an ICU nurse in the relative calm of Dnipro, a city she now rarely saw. The sterile, controlled environment of the hospital felt like a lifetime ago. Here, her operating room was the muddy floor of a trench. Her patients were brothers in arms, and the only constant was the thunderous percussion of artillery in the distance. When she first joined the 231st Battalion, known by its call sign Wild Field, she had faced the familiar, weary skepticism. She was a woman, a medic, and in the unspoken hierarchy of the infantry, she was seen as a liability to be protected, not a fighter. She endured the heavy silences and the patronizing comments. They scoffed. "Medics don't fight," she would later recall. The sentiment was a hard, cold fact of military life. Her place was in the rear, with the bandages and the morphine, safely away from the business of pulling triggers. Svitlana learned to let the words wash over her. She trained with them anyway, learning the weight of an assault rifle not just as a piece of kit to be carried, but as a tool she might one day need. And she watched the horizons, learned the difference between outgoing and incoming fire, and prayed her skills with a tourniquet would never be needed by the men who scoffed. The day that changed everything began like any other on the front. A low-hanging sky pressed down on the positions, muffling sound and creating an eerie, oppressive silence. Svitlana's unit was manning a critical section of the line. They were tired, hollow-eyed from weeks of rotation with little respite. The Russian forces had been probing their defenses for days, looking for a weak point. Intel had warned of a possible assault, but in war, warnings are as common as the wind. It started not with a bang, but with a low rumble that grew into a terrifying roar. The horizon seemed to light up as a coordinated Russian assault was unleashed. Armored personnel carriers, and their engines screaming, churned up the muddy ground, followed by waves of infantry. The objective was clear: overrun the Ukrainian positions, break the line, and pour through the gap. For Svitlana's unit, the world collapsed into a cacophony of noise. The deafening crack of small arms fire, the whoosh of rocket-propelled grenades, and the desperate shouts of her comrades. The initial wave hit them like a sledgehammer. Within minutes, the air was thick with smoke and the acrid smell of burnt gunpowder. Svitlana was pinned down in a dugout, her medical bag clutched to her chest, as incoming rounds chewed up the earth just inches from her position. Over the radio, the situation deteriorated rapidly. The unit's commanding officer had become a casualty in the first few minutes of the fight, his voice going silent mid-sentence. Panic, that cold and insidious enemy, began to creep into the edges of the defensive line. Men looked around for orders, for direction, and found only chaos. Svitlana had an open radio link to a superior officer further back. Through the static, she could hear the desperate situation being assessed. The Russians had pushed past their forward positions. They were dangerously close, just 2 houses away from the main command post. The tactical situation was a nightmare. If they took that position, the entire line would collapse, and the unit would be encircled and annihilated. There was no one left to give the order. There was no one left to lead the counterattack. The men in her trench looked at her, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and a desperate, unspoken question. What do we do? In that moment, and the scoffing echoes of "medics don't fight" were drowned out by the sheer raw imperative of survival. Svitlana knew that if she waited for a miracle, they would all be dead. Her eyes scanned the dugout and landed on an RGP-40, a single-use disposable grenade launcher that one of the fallen soldiers had left behind. It was a weapon designed for one purpose: to destroy. It was the antithesis of everything she stood for. Her hands, trained to save lives, gently placed her medical bag on the ground. She picked up the launcher. The cold, heavy plastic felt alien in her grip. She checked the safety, a motion she had practiced 100 times in training, but which now felt impossibly significant. "I told the guys not to back down," she said later, her voice steady despite the memory of the terror. "Then I went out to meet them. They were already too close." She didn't think. Thinking would have frozen her. She simply moved. Slipping out of the trench, she used the smoke and the shattered remnants of a wall for cover. The enemy was so close she could hear their shouted commands in a foreign tongue. She crept to a position that gave her a direct line of sight to the house they had occupied. The house that was the key to the entire battlefield. She could see muzzle flashes from the windows. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the cold metal of the launcher. She raised the weapon, aimed at the window where the heaviest fire was coming from, and squeezed the trigger. The backblast kicked up a cloud of dust and debris. The grenade flew true, a streak of lethal momentum arcing through the smoky air. It punched through the window frame and detonated inside. The explosion was a violent, concussive blast that shattered the silence. Wood, glass, and debris sprayed from the opening. For a moment, the world was quiet. Then, the silence was broken by the screams of the wounded and the panicked shouts of the surviving Russian soldiers as they abandoned the position, dragging their casualties with them. Svitlana didn't wait to admire her work. Adrenaline surging, she scrambled back to her unit's line. The sight of their medic, having just single-handedly broken the back of the enemy assault, ignited a fire in the men. The hesitation was gone. The panic evaporated, replaced by a cold, focused rage. They picked up their rifles and poured fire into the retreating enemy, solidifying their defense. The line held, and the rotation was completed safely. The unit survived. When the firing finally stopped and the acrid smoke began to clear, the men looked at Svitlana differently. The scoffing was a distant, shameful memory. They hadn't just seen a medic save a life. They had seen a warrior save their lives. The weapon she had used was now just a discarded tube on the ground. She walked back to her medical bag, picked it up, and immediately went to work checking her comrades for wounds, her hands steady and sure once more. The line between healer and fighter had been erased in the crucible of combat. Svitlana was no longer just Doc. She was one of them, a soldier who had proved that on a battlefield, the will to protect your family is the most potent weapon of all.